Good evening to you. Good evening to you. Good evening to you. You all get my operatic voice that I get to work on in the evening. Good evening to you. Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody has been having a great, spantabulous, fantastic day. Listen, I wanted to come on a little bit early this evening because I know that it's Friday night. You know, as the song says, some people just got paid. Friday night, party hardy, getting it started, date night, all of that stuff, movie night, all of that stuff. So I did want to make sure that I stayed on track with our episodes. So here we are. We're on episode 13, and we are talking healthy, wealthy, wise. Today we're going to continue yet another section on your score. And we've been talking about identity theft with your credit and making sure that you are doing what you can to protect yourself from identity theft, and there are different kinds of identity theft that I'm finding out about, which is the other parts that we're going to be covering today. We're going to cover some more today on that, and then we're going to move over into a new book that we'll probably be in for a couple of weeks called The Bad Food of the Bible, The Bad Food Bible rather, how and why to eat sinfully. The title was very striking and intriguing, so I picked it up, and we are actually going to be learning about butter, meat, eggs, salt, gluten, GMOs, alcohol, coffee, diet soda, MSG, and non-organic foods. So we're going to be in this book looking at some of the myths behind these foods and what's really going on with these foods. So we're going to start this as an introduction today. The Bad Food Bible, how and why to eat sinfully. Now don't lose it. Okay, saints of God, don't lose it. He's simply talking about the good and the bad and why you should enjoy eating your food. Couple of announcements. If you are following me on YouTube Live, you can hit the bell on YouTube, and that will allow you to know when I'm going live. It will give you notifications of when I'm live so you won't miss them. You can share and subscribe to either the YouTube channel or my Periscope. And I am taking a look at those who are subscribing so that I can follow you back. So I will take a look at my followers this weekend, make sure that you're a real person, not a troll, and I will follow you back. And then also, we are co-hosting an event on Labor Day right in Warrenton, Virginia, which is September 3rd, that Monday, Labor Day, September 3rd, from 6 to 9 p.m. in Warrenton, Virginia. It's going to be an evening of worship and prayer, an evening of worship and prayer. So if you'd like more information about that, we're calling it a labor of love, a call to citizens to pray for our country and to pray for our culture shift and transformation in a positive direction. So we do have some intercessors, some worship singers who will be joining us in that endeavor. We're going to be putting out the flyer on Monday for it. So if you want more information from me specifically, or you are in the area, you're in the DMV area, and you say, hey, I want to be a part of that, I want to know more information, please email me at reachshante@gmail.com. Again, that's reachshante@gmail.com. This is an event that is citizen sponsored. So what does that mean? That means that we are all in for the glory and the praise of the Lord. There's no fame to be had. There's no big name tickets. There's no What else? There's no fanfare with the flyer. Your face isn't going to be on the flyer because again, this is all about for the glory and the honor and the praise of the Lord. So if you are passionate about social change, if you are passionate about justice being done in our country, if you are passionate about loving this country and you are concerned about the direction in which our country is headed, then this would be the perfect event for you to join into on September 3rd, Labor Day, 6 to 9 p.m. in Warrenton, Virginia. So please reach out to me and let me know how you want to get involved. All right. That is, again, reachshante@gmail.com. Reachshante@gmail.com. All right. So let's get it cracking. Let's get it cracking, as they say. We're back in Your Score. Excellent book. It has been invaluable in the information that we've been learning. And if you've been applying the information, you should actually start to see by this time, you should start to see improvements in your credit score if you're actually applying the lessons that we're sharing in this book. All right. Your Score and Insider Secrets to Understanding, Controlling, and Protecting Your Credit Score by Anthony Davenport. Anthony worked on the inside in terms of being one who worked with banks, so he understands how banks view your credit, what they're actually looking at, and he is really giving us the inside scoop. We're on chapter 8 right now, protecting your credit score from identity theft, and we have so far talked about financial identity theft. That's where we last left off, and we talked about different kinds of levels of security that you need for your information. We talked about red level security, things that you definitely shouldn't be giving out, yellow level security, and then green level, which is things that most people might know if they're trying to inquire about your credit. And so I want to go over those three again. Red level would be your full or partial social security number, your credit card number, your mother's maiden name. Yellow level security would be your CVC number, which is that number on the back of your credit card, your date of birth, your full date of birth, your full cell phone number, and your high school mascot. And then green level would be simply your name and your address. And also, if you're a business owner, you want to make sure that you are not using your personal home address. Even the business owners who are small business owners who may be working from home, it is always a good idea to get a post office box, because what you don't want is you don't want people showing up at your front door that you didn't expect showing up at your front door. All right, so those were just some beginning tips. And now today we're going to get into medical identity theft, child identity theft, and guarding your identity. Guarding your identity. So if you have pen and paper, or if you have, some people like to text notes to themselves or email notes to themselves, you can do that. You have a tablet. Let's get rolling. Medical identity theft. Credit card balances, student debt, mortgage payments, and car loans cause people plenty of stress. But at least those financial tools and the statements that come with them are relatively straightforward. The world of medical treatment is extremely confusing, and that's even if you have insurance. It's always a struggle to figure out what's covered and what isn't, how things are being paid for, and what happens when a bill doesn't get paid. The lawyers and layers of bureaucracy between the consumer, the hospital, and the insurance company leave plenty of space for mistakes to be made and for crooks to try and get involved. Because most people don't come into month to month contact with their health insurance the way they do a credit card or mortgage statement, they aren't sure what to look for when it comes to mistakes or fraud. So it shouldn't be a huge surprise that medical identity theft is one of the fastest growing forms of information crime in the United States. You might be wondering what motivation a bad guy would have to hijack your medical information and why we're talking about it in a book on credit scores. I will answer the second question first. Medical debt is one of the main reasons consumers get negative hits from one of the credit bureaus. Often it's because a relatively small medical debt gets missed over the course of insurance covering most of a procedure, and the consumer doesn't know about the oversight. By the time it gets noticed, that relatively small debt has crushed the consumer's credit score. In other cases, the sheer size of an uncovered medical expense can drive a consumer straight to bankruptcy. In fact, more than 60% of all bankruptcies are related to medical debt. In other words, the financial and medical worlds are directly related. As for criminal motivation, there is plenty. With access to your medical credentials like insurance group ID numbers, social security numbers, or Medicare number, a bad guy can cause you a variety of problems. He can use your credentials to see a doctor and actually get bogus prescription drugs, which are then sold on the black market. If he has some knowledge of medical billing and procedures, he can sell the information to dirty medical clinics that can run up gigantic phony medical bills in your name and hit your insurance company for payment. By the time anybody sorts out what has been going on, the crooks have already closed up shop and moved along with the insurance company's money. You're left with uncovered medical expenses on your tab that you don't know anything about and the task of sorting it all out. Doing that legwork to untangle the mess might be a headache, but the physical problems that medical identity creates can be even more serious. It only takes a keystroke error from an insurance company to intermingle your legitimate medical records with bogus ones that have been set up by fraudulent people. That leaves a paper trail that could be misinterpreted by your doctor or your insurance company and can cause you either to be denied coverage should you be getting or need to get treatment for a problem you don't necessarily have. Those could be life and death mistakes. This is why you have to be as vigilant with your medical information as you are with your financial information. Treat those ID cards and your social security card just like a credit card because in many ways they work the same. In fact, you should resist giving your social security number to the hospital because there's no legal requirement to do so. And the hospital will only be using it to sell your medical debt to a collector if you run into a problem later on. Plus, hospitals have proven to be some of the easiest organizations for hackers to penetrate. The tools for handling your medical information are very similar to those that you use to handle your financial life. You have to pay attention to all correspondence that comes from your insurance company. Make sure the bills and claims of service match the services you've actually used and procedures you've had. For example, if you get a letter saying a certain kind of service hasn't been pre-approved, that you've never tried to get, or that particular service looks like something that you don't have a problem with medically, that's an indication that someone might be trying to access your account. For some people, this kind of attention is going to be a big job. If you have a lot of medical problems or a big family with a lot of people who receive different kinds of medical treatment, you're going to have to juggle a lot of information. Being very careful and attentive about reading your credit report is another way you can keep on top of this information. Here's the bottom line. If medical collections you don't recognize start appearing on your credit report, it's imperative that you track those collections to their root before the problem gets bigger. All right? Here is the next one. All right? And many people know about this one when tax time comes because they are affected. This one is called child identity theft. Child identity theft. Kids have two things that make them very attractive to identity thieves. Children have social security numbers and they have a clean financial slate. If a thief can get your child's social, they can set up bogus accounts under their name and number and rely on the fact that the child isn't in a position to be monitoring their credit report or complain if they don't get approved for a loan. The Bureau's official policies are that they don't compile credit records for anyone under 18 years old. But if a child's data is compromised and used to create a phony profile, A legitimate name and social security number, but a fake birth date, is something the child might not discover until they turn 18 and try to apply for a credit account for real. Then they're in for a rude surprise. One of the most famous cases is that of a 19-year-old woman who applied for a credit card when she was in college. She discovered that identity thieves had taken over when she was 9 and had run up more than $1 million in debt with her social security number. If you suspect child identity theft has happened, call the three main credit bureaus to notify them and ask if they have any record of credit being opened up in that name. You'll be asked to provide the name and social. The answer you want to hear is that they have no records found under those credentials. You can even do this now if you have children under the age of 18 to check and ensure and make sure no one has already begun trying to tap into them as a credit profile. All right. You can also request that your child's credit profile be frozen until the age of 18. That's pretty awesome to know. Not all of the violations come at the hands of criminals either. Because of the prevalence of social media, children are sharing way more information with the world than ever before, and probably more than they should. They're doing everything online, including unknowingly giving information to people who will use it to hurt them or you. Need an example? When a child posts a picture of his or her parents partying at a vacation spot in the Bahamas, it isn't hard to figure out that people aren't home guarding the house. One client's son tweeted that he and his parents were about to board a flight from China back home to California. By the time they got off the plane in LA, a thief had wired all of the money out of one of their accounts. That's how easy it is for someone to take the information that you are willingly giving and use it against you. So this leads us to guarding your identity. If all of this sounds pretty intense, it should. It's a serious issue and you need to take aggressive steps both to prevent it from happening to you and to fix it if it does. If it starts with adapting your behavior to reflect some of these risks. I'll give you the same speech I give my high-profile clients. Information you share willingly with the world, and most of you on here know that I talk about this quite a bit. Information that you share with the world, either in the form of email, subscription data with an online service, or even what you put out through social media like Facebook and Twitter, is all fair game for data thieves. If they target you, they're going to use everything at their disposal. Giving out some information is unavoidable, but you can control a lot of it yourself. It's obviously unwise to broadcast your social security number, but you also need to be careful with other kinds of information as well to avoid giving data thieves clues they can use to find your information and make guesses about things like your passwords or your credit card numbers. A lot of times, one thing that I've noticed is that when people are making purchases or when they are making deals, sometimes people will say, hey, look at this deal that I got, right? And they will take a picture of their receipt and then they'll post it online. Well, you don't want to take a picture of your full receipt. Why? Because it has part of your credit card number at the bottom of the receipt many times, your credit card or your debit card number. So just simple things like that, being mindful of not sharing your personal information by photograph. Even if you are excited about something, just make sure you are covering up pertinent information about yourself, like your home address. That's another one that I see people often sharing on social media. And then sometimes I inbox people and I say, hey, you might want to not share your child's school name or your child's school address, because again, those are pieces of information that can help a person who is intent on doing something illegal. You are giving them extra information about yourself that they don't need to have. All right. So, on social media, avoid giving out specific details like, as I said, your address, your children's names, birth dates, phone numbers. I've seen people even do that. Like, somebody will be having a public discourse and they'll say, "Hey, I've been trying to reach you. Give me a call at," and they will post their entire phone number online. And I'm like, oh, you should have. That's something that you can inbox the person, right? You don't want to put your entire phone number online. There's a lot of things people can trace about you by your full phone number. All right. Um, what else? Right. So, for example, with the phone number, the writer says here, even something that seemingly is innocent, like your phone number, can be used by a thief to verify information with a rookie phone representative and get a foot in the door. You've done the drill enough times yourself when talking to a representative from your cell phone provider. Any kind of identifying information they're asking you to confirm your identity isn't information you should be making easy for someone else to find online. If you need proof that putting more information out there is dangerous, let me take you to the fifth grade class at St. Elizabeth Catholic Academy in Queens, New York. I asked 30 10-year-olds to use the internet to see what kind of information they could find about their favorite celebrities. It took one child just 21 minutes to come up with enough information from web searches to be able to open a credit line in that celebrity's name. Hard to believe, but absolutely true. Your computer and smartphone are two of the most useful pieces of equipment you own, but they can both get you into serious trouble if you aren't careful. On your computer, the web browser is the information superhighway thieves use to get in and take your data out. Most people don't even take the most basic steps to secure themselves, like using secure passwords, being careful about how they log in and out of various financial websites. So even if you are checking your banking online, making sure that you're signing out and you're logging out completely is something that is very basic but also very helpful. So here are some basic rules of the road. Number one, use two-factor authentication for your email accounts. Most email providers offer it, and it's a simple way to block unauthorized access. That means that it requires two pieces of information from you to enter the account or change information, like to change a password, and a second form of authentication through a different device, like a text message to your phone. I know Google offers that. It'll say if you want to, do you want to add another device, or do you want to add another way to change your password, and you can put your phone number in, or you can even put in another email address that you may have. So that's what's called two-factor authentication. All right. The second one is make your passwords different for each site and make them something nobody could easily guess. Something with a mixture of letters, numbers, and symbols is obviously going to be better than simple phrases. Even better are the password managers that generate random passwords for your site, for every site that you use. You control them with a single master password only you know. Third, keep an up-to-date version of antivirus software on your you can do it on your computer, and now they also have it on your phones at all times. Update your browser regularly to make sure its security patches are in place. All right. Number 4, when you log into a bank, credit card, or other sensitive financial website, make sure you are doing it on a trusted network at home or work, not a public one like at a library or a coffee shop. Never, ever, 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 if you can help it, get online to do financial transactions at a public Wi-Fi site, because it can be hacked. All right. And then most of us recognize that we're on a secure site when we see HTTPS at the end. The S at the end lets you know it's a secure site. All right. It's extremely easy for a hacker to snoop on public Wi-Fi traffic and snag your information while you are in checking your financial information. All right. So if you want to check financial information, it is advised that you either use your own private Wi-Fi and don't tap into public Wi-Fi, like if you're, like they said, if you're at a coffee shop, or just do it at home. No matter what network you use, be sure to quit out of your browser completely after you log out of your financial websites. Otherwise, your data could be stored. Next, before you get rid of your computer, be sure to erase the hard drive completely with reputable software. If you just trash your files, a thief can easily resurrect your old computer files. Smartphones carry just as much important information, especially now that they're being used as digital wallets for checkout at your favorite supermarket. Your phone is filled with information that a data thief could use to steal your identity or appropriate one of your financial accounts. You need to treat it just as you would your personal computer. So one thing I found out recently when I accidentally left both of my phones, and I was without my both of my phones for a weekend, I was able to call my provider and I was able to get them to shut down all of my data that could have been accessed through my phone. And they were able to suspend my accounts to both phones so that if somebody found my phone, they couldn't just go right in and go into all of my data. So if you ever have an issue where you lose a phone, the first thing you want to do, even if you find it later, you should be able to call your provider and ask them to suspend the account until you can find the phone if you have an idea of where the phone is. And then when you get the phone, then they'll be able to put your data back on and restart your information in your phone. All right, that's just a quick way to do that so that you aren't freaking out. Next, at the minimum, use a PIN to secure your phone. Virtually every phone has a feature that disables the phone if someone punches the wrong PIN repeatedly. Use this feature even if it might be annoying to constantly be typing in a PIN. The biometric fingerprint readers on iPhones are great for convenience and perform the same function. However, if you're not interested yet in getting into biometrics, you can use the PIN. You can use also, they have, most phones have where you can, if you put your finger on in a certain pattern, that can also be used as a password as well. Next, remember that access into your phone is like gaining access into your email account. If a hacker can read your email, they can gain entry to a lot of your financial world. Consider creating a specific email address just for your most sensitive financial accounts and keep that account separate from the built-in mail apps on your phone. If you need access, you can always go to the phone's web browser and log in that way. So he recommends doing it for your most sensitive information. I recommend doing a separate email account for your least sensitive information and let all your junk mail go in that direction. Speaking of browsers, treat the browser on your phone like the one on your computer. Be cautious about the mobile Wi-Fi networks you use and quit out of the phone browser after you've used it to log into a financial account. Public Wi-Fi is not secure. Let me say it one more time. Public Wi-Fi is free, but it's not secure. You're better off using your cell signal to log into financial apps. It's much more difficult for a hacker to intercept information traveling on a cell signal than on a public Wi-Fi network. So again, if you are checking financial information, you don't want to do it through public Wi-Fi. Any questions so far? All right. So we're going to stop there for today. Next week, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about being careful about credit monitoring, what to do if your identity is stolen, and how to freeze your credit. We will cover those things on next week. We are right at the halfway mark, which is excellent. And that will give us opportunity to start the Bad Food Bible, How and Why to Eat Sinfully. by Dr. Aaron Carroll. So let's jump right in. Introduction. Recently, an old friend of mine was in town for a visit. He loves food, as do my wife and I, so we took him out to a nice restaurant here in Indiana. When it came time to order our entrees, I found myself in an all too common predicament. Should I order the healthy option or the one that sounded the tastiest? Luckily, I've become somewhat of an expert on this type of dilemma, so I chose the tenderloin. It proved to be one of the best pieces of meat I've ever eaten. My wife and our friend ordered dishes they thought were healthier. They didn't seem to enjoy their meals as much as I did, but they could console themselves with the knowledge that they had made the right choice in the long run. Well, had they? It depends on whom you ask. Today, self professed experts of all stripes, from doctors to dietitians, weight loss gurus to personal trainers, bloggers to YouTubers, and everyone in between, seem to have radically different opinions about what we should be eating and why. All of these viewpoints, well intentioned though they may be, buffet us with wave after wave of dietary advice that promises to make us thinner, cure us of disease, and ultimately extend our lives. We should eat like the cavemen did, some say. We should avoid gluten completely, others say. We should eat only organic or vegetarian or vegan. These different waves of advice push us in one direction and then another. More often than not, we end up right where we started, but with thinner wallets and thicker waistlines. If you have a hard time keeping all of these recommendations straight or choosing between them, you are not alone. I'm a physician and researcher who has a particular interest in analyzing dietary health research, and even I find my head spinning when I think of the number of perspectives out here. This is one of the reasons I decided to focus much of my writing on dietary health. I wanted to be able to advise patients about what healthy eating looks like, and I also wanted to practice it myself. These conflicting opinions about food have one thing in common: the belief that some foods will kill you, or at the very least, that those foods are the reason you're not at the weight that you'd like to be. This is an attitude about food that, ironically, has its roots in an earlier and opposite idea that some foods can actually keep us from dying. Indeed, some of the earliest expert advice about food was predicated on this notion. The first nutritional guidelines endorsed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture appeared in 1894. They were a product of the times. In the late 19th century, people in the United States were eating more calories and consuming more meat and fish than people in most other countries in the world. Even so, many Americans were malnourished. Rickets, beriberi, and scurvy, conditions that were caused by nutritional deficiencies, were much more common than they are today. As a result, experts' dietary recommendations focused on eating a variety of foods in a balanced way to overcome the deficits. At that time, however, links between specific components of food and health problems were vague. That began to change in the 20th century when scientists started figuring out how to identify vitamins and minerals in the lab. They better understood how individual nutrients, vitamins, and minerals were related to health and well being. These breakthroughs led governments around the world to implement policy and guidelines that encourage people to eat foods that were rich in or fortified with vitamins such as D, B, and C. These efforts worked. Rickets, beriberi, and scurvy are nearly unheard of now in the developed world. Those early successes gave many people the impression that some foods have medicinal properties. But what's true for vitamin deficiencies aren't necessarily true for other illnesses. Cutting certain kinds of food out of your diet altogether is not guaranteed to fully cure a disease. Sometimes, in fact, it can actually harm you. Today, the number one killer in much of the Western world is actually heart disease. We've struggled to come up with nutritional guidelines that can put a dent in the problem. By the 1970s, for example, some scientists came to believe that we were eating too much of some nutrients, especially fats. The nutritional guidelines began to advise us to avoid fats and the meats that accompany them. We were told that those things would kill us. It seemed like sensible advice at the time, but now, several decades after those guidelines were developed, it looks like they might have made things worse. When people cut fat and meat out of their diets, they must eat something else. Okay? For diners in the late 20th century, this meant turning to grains and other carbohydrates. The results were not pretty. Obesity rates shot through the roof, as did the incidence of diabetes and heart disease. As it turns out, meat and fats were never really the danger researchers and healthcare professionals made them out to be, at least not to the extent that many experts claimed. Now, let us put a plug here because we're seeing what is happening with the meat industry and how meat is being processed and how meat is being packaged could actually be more of the problem than the meat itself. All right, there was a recent article that came out that talked about the antibiotic resistant bacteria that was being found in meat. That there could be some problems with that. So, could it be how they're being packaged and processed that's the problem? We're going to find out. Nor was cholesterol. Even as we have begun to appreciate these facts, we have found other foods to blame for our problems. Today, we actually focus on new dangers, including gluten, genetically modified organisms or GMOs, and artificial sweeteners. None of these things are as dangerous as you might think either, but that has not stopped medical experts and lay people alike from demonizing them. These reactions and counterreactions point to an uncomfortable truth about the field of dietary health. Scientists and doctors are often guilty of acting without sufficient evidence, of making recommendations without having sufficient facts. Most of the time, they are trying to do the right thing, but in some cases, their efforts can actually have the opposite effect. The dirty little secret of medical science. Babies spit up a lot. When this spitting up becomes a problem, when it causes them pain or interferes with weight gain, their parents often bring them to the doctor. When it gets really bad, pediatricians, like me, give it a fancy name: gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. Because doctors like to fix problems, pediatricians are likely to recommend any number of interventions to treat GERD in infants. If these fixes don't work, we might recommend putting babies in an infant seat, giving them a pacifier, having them sleep on a wedge. None of these treatments actually work, but the last one may be the least effective of all. The wedge is a foam incline about 2 feet long that is sloped to reach the height of about 1 foot on one end. When I was a resident, the hospital in which I was training would create wedges for patients upon request. They made a ton of them and charged $150 a piece. Insurance did not cover the wedges, but many parents, thinking that their baby's health was at stake, somehow came up with the cash. I had a hard time believing the wedges were worth the cost, so I set out to find evidence in the medical literature to support their use. I could not find any. When I challenged doctors about this, I would get all kinds of responses. Patients who were put on wedges got better. Doctors and others they knew swore by them. Parents didn't mind the wedges and they were easy to use. So what was the harm? My colleagues who defend prescribing wedges weren't entirely wrong when they said that babies who were put on them got better. That's because babies with GERD are almost always not sick. Infants vomit because they have an all-liquid diet. They also have an immature esophageal sphincter, which doesn't quite close the stomach off from the esophagus, allowing stomach acid to travel the wrong way in their digestive tract. They eat every few hours. They have a small stomach. Countless infants have symptoms of GERD. About 95% of them who have it get better on their own. Therefore, anything we do, whether it's thickening their food, changing their formula, or giving them a wedge, makes no difference at all. The wedge appears to work because as time passes, the infants start sitting up and then walking, and then they also start eating solid food. The appearance of success was enough to convince many doctors that the wedges were what made them successful. Because the babies they put wedges on got better, they assumed that the wedge worked. They weren't ignoring the evidence, it just wasn't good evidence. These doctors were, however, ignoring many of the downsides to wedges. Parents hated them, they were a pain to carry around. Many mothers and fathers feared letting their infants even nap without them. This meant they had to purchase additional wedges for other places where their babies might spend a lot of time. More often than not, it seemed the wedges were causing the parents and the child to suffer while making the families poorer, all without actually doing any good. So, I decided to set the record straight, he writes. In my free time, I deepened my search, scouring the medical literature even more thoroughly to make sure that I had not missed anything. I reviewed more than 2,500 studies and identified only 35 that might discuss this kind of treatment. Eventually, 10 randomized controlled trials met with criteria I was looking for. The paper based on this work was my first official publication and the first step on the road to me becoming a medical researcher. What surprised me wasn't that my paper got published, but that it was so widely read. It is still one of the most cited pieces of work today. This is not because I broke new ground, but because it gathered and explained the research behind a common problem in a systematic and usable way, something that health experts do not do nearly enough. This dirty little secret of medical science is this: much of what we do as doctors is a best guess. This is why it's called the practice of medicine. Hip, hip, hooray for the honest doctor here, all right? That's why it's called the practice of medicine, because they are practicing on you, the patient. Hence why many of us trust in the great physician who is not practicing on us. He's actually can give us actual solid help when our doctors are just practicing, okay? Very few of the recommendations we make are scientifically proven or based on a medical consensus that we are absolutely sure is true. Even more disturbingly, when good evidence does exist, we ignore it. The wedge paper offered me my first glimpse of this sad fact, and as the years passed, I became increasingly dismayed by it and more determined to bring it to light. The root of the problem is this: all research is not created equal. Everyone knows that on some level. How many times have you tuned into the news to hear some new miracle advance, only to see years later that that thing did not pan out? How many vitamins have been announced as the key to living longer, to building more muscle, or to losing weight? Years later, they go out of style and we watch the next shiny object come into play. I became so frustrated with these obstacles to good decision making about human health that I decided my time would be better spent trying to get doctors in the healthcare system to do right, proven things, than trying to get patients to do what doctors might think is right. This is how eventually I ended up at Indiana University School of Medicine, working as a researcher and directing the school's health policy and professionalism research. In the past few years, I've been able to write and focus my time on data, evidence, and research, and explaining to readers how those things relate to health and health policy. People have a real hunger for scientific evidence about dietary health, and I take joy in giving it to them. I break down complex research, describe what science actually says about what we should eat. Often this involves killing a sacred cow or two in the thoughts, but the upside is that debunking bad claims about food I often hear, and I cleared the way for good news. I have good news and bad news for you at the outset of this reading. The bad news is that you are likely worrying too much about some of the foods you eat and feeling too positive about others. The good news is there is a solution. In this book, we're going to teach you how to think about nutrition and how not to worry so much about many of the things you've been told about food, especially the warnings to stay away from certain ingredients or categories because they're bad for you. Full stop. If there's one message I want you to take away, is that you should feel free to enjoy almost any food without worrying that it will negatively impact your health. More importantly than what you're eating is actually how you're eating it, especially how often and how much. Anyone who tells you different is likely relying on wrong or incomplete information. We will lay out rules of thumb for enjoying a healthy relationship with supposedly the most unhealthy foods. But to understand these conclusions, you need to know what kind of evidence you should pay attention to and what kind you can safely disregard. So, he's going to take us through understanding how to rate a scientific study, and we're going to stop here for today because I want to make sure I don't run out of time. How to rate a scientific study, because you see them all the time. The first thing to remember when you read a new research finding about dietary health is that human beings are really complicated beings. The reasons we eat certain foods, or do anything else for that matter, are far more complex than are for most, if not all, other organisms. They're certainly much more complex than they are for isolated cells or cultures in a test tube. Therefore, any study that involves only chemicals or animals in a lab should be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not saying that such research is wrong per se. I'm just saying it needs to be replicated and studied in actual people before we can really assume that it applies to human beings. This is true when it comes to research using animals such as mice or rats. Small animal research is ubiquitous in nutrition science, despite the fact that it has been shown to be flawed time and time again. Sometimes it's flawed because studies of the ways mice eat do not translate to accurate conclusions about the way that human beings eat. Sometimes it's because studies use huge amounts of food over short periods of time, which also don't model normal human behavior. Some mice studies rely only on a few animals or on animals that are genetically very similar, and they don't use female mice. When researchers study mice, they want to be able to control as many factors as possible. They also want the mice to be as similar as possible so they don't have to worry about hormonal differences or, even worse, pregnant females. Because of this, it's often easier not to use female mice, which is a scientific shortcut that also undermines the implications of research for humans. The bottom line is that you should be suspicious of any dietary advice that's predicated on research involving only chemicals or animals. That is not enough. To make claims about human health, you need human studies or human study subjects. Even when it comes to human studies, there's a hierarchy of research to consider, a scale of rigor and reliability that tells us to trust some studies more than others, and even discount certain classes of scientific evidence altogether. So, to begin with, the lowest form of research is anecdote. The lowest form of research is the anecdote. That's just a story. For example, my great grandmother ate a tablespoon of Tabasco every morning and she lived to be nearly 100. We hear stories like this all the time. It could be our story or someone else's, but either way, it's no more than one example. Anecdotes, with few exceptions, have no scientific worth whatsoever. Just above the anecdote in the hierarchy of research is what's called case series. So let me put this down here. All right. Case series. All right. This is a collection of anecdotes, a description of a few examples with no statistical tests to determine whether relationships between factors really exist and how sure of those relationships the researchers might be. Imagine reading a paper describing 10 people who ate 10 tablespoons of Tabasco every day and happened to be very healthy. That would be a case series. It's always been my suspicion that these were invented by researchers who wanted to make their anecdotes sound more official. The next kind of research, the first kind that we might actually take seriously, is called a cross sectional study. A cross sectional study. These studies usually look at a random set of people at a certain point in time to see how one factor might relate to another. Every time you read or hear about a survey talking about how many people do one thing or another, such as eating a table of Tabasco sauce every day, that is a cross-sectional study. This type of study is great for showing how people do the same thing, but there are different people in the study. How many men eat meat, for example? How many young adults are on a certain kind of diet? But not much more. Next up is what's called a case controlled study. A case controlled study. In this type of research, scientists gather a bunch of people who have a certain condition or case, along with similar people, perhaps those of the same age, sex, and geographic location, who don't have that condition, or those are the controls. Then the researchers use statistics to see how the people with that condition are different from those without it. Imagine that we gather a bunch of people who don't have stomach cancer and another bunch who do. And ask both groups if and perhaps how often they eat a tablespoon of Tabasco and then analyze the results. This would qualify as a case control study. Studies like this are better than the ones previously discussed because they can suffer from what's known as recall bias. When people think about things that occurred in the past, they're more likely to remember these things one way if they're sick and another way if they're not. This kind of bias shows up all the time in health research, including dietary studies. People who have a rare disease are more likely to report having eaten certain things, especially if they have heard that those things are bad, than people who are healthy. An even better type of research is what's called the cohort study. Cohort study. This is when a group of people, the cohorts, are followed over time in an attempt to discern how certain factors affect them differently. For instance, how certain foods might cause them to gain weight or contract disease. In our Tabasco example, we might keep track of which of them eat a tablespoon every day and wait to see what health patterns emerge among them, and then try to link these patterns to how much Tabasco they're intaking. Cohort studies are either retrospective, when researchers gather people and measure stuff that happened to them in the past, or prospective, when they gather people and measure what happens to them over time in the future. For the most part, they're better than case control studies and less subject to recall bias, but they're still imperfect. Every one of the studies I've discussed up to this point qualifies as observational studies. So all of these are observational. All right. This class of research can only establish associations or correlations between different variables. It cannot prove that one thing causes another. It can tell us, for instance, that people who consume Tabasco are more likely to be overweight, but that doesn't mean that Tabasco necessarily causes weight gain. Another factor could be involved. Perhaps people who eat Tabasco also eat a lot of meat, and that is what makes them heavier. Mistaking correlation for causation is one of the most prevalent problems in reporting on health research, including that of dietary health. I also want to say that's one of the most prevalent causes in spiritual life, too. Mistaking correlation for causation. Way too often, the media latches onto an observational study that has linked some food to a health problem and then reports that the former causes the latter. Observational studies simply cannot prove that. To prove causation and not simply correlation, we need what's called an experimental study. An experimental study. That's when we take a group of people and split them up. Some people get one thing, the others get something else. In an ideal study, researchers also place participants into these groups randomly so that no one involved in the study has any control over which subjects get which intervention. That way, the researchers can be sure that any differences they see between the groups are caused by the thing they are studying and not some other factor. Further, the very best studies are controlled by giving a placebo to the group that doesn't receive the thing being studied. In this way, neither the participants nor the people conducting the study know what is going on and thus cannot inadvertently influence the results. This sort of experimental study is the highest form, is called a RCT, or randomized control trial. RCT, randomized control trial. When it comes to determining the impact of diet on human health, RCTs are the gold standard. They are leagues above observational studies. This is because they are pretty much the only kind of studies that can establish causality, that can consistently prove that one thing causes another. Randomized controlled trials are also exceedingly rare. It's not hard to see why. To conduct one, researchers have to gather many people together, properly enroll them, figure out what to do to them, run the studies while keeping track of everyone for a period of time, measure the results, then analyze them. These kinds of studies can cost millions of dollars and be very difficult to conduct. Because they are hard to come by, almost everything we know about dietary health is actually based on small, flawed observational studies. These conclusions we draw from them are limited, and the results are often oversold by researchers and the media. This is the case not only for more recent studies, but also for the older research that forms the basis of much of what we currently believe to be true about dietary health. Luckily, though, good studies are hard to come by. Researchers have ways of maximizing their impact. We can do a systematic review, gathering good research together and summarizing what it says. So, he says, I try to cite these meta analysis and systematic reviews whenever I discuss studies. I have held to myself that standard in this book as much as possible. Instead of focusing on single studies, I try to talk about a body of research. And where I do cite individual studies, I try to cite the highest possible kind of research, the RCT. I try to place them in context of the medical literature. I favor the studies of human beings over rats and real outcomes over process measures. Process measures are linked to and perhaps even lead to the outcomes we really care about, but the information they provide is not as reliable as data on the outcomes themselves. Throughout this book, I talk about how lesser quality research has led us to make bad nutritional decisions. I point out how good research has often been ignored. But, but because most of the existing research on dietary health is fundamentally limited, I try to debunk many myths here about bad foods and by extension present a lot of good news about ingredients you love but thought that you couldn't have. So, next week we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the limits of nutritional science, and then we're going to jump right into the first bad food, which is one that a lot of people like, by the way, butter. All right. So I want to thank you for participating with me today. Thank you for jumping into Daring Dialogues for the evening edition. And I have been your host today. I hope I have said something that was helpful to you, whether on the credit side or on the health side. I think it's very important because so many health articles are out here that we need to start understanding where their research comes from, right? We need to make sure that people aren't just giving us an anecdotal thing or a case series or a cross sectional or a case control, because those are not the highest levels of data to go by to determine what you should be eating. All right. So, again, I want to thank you for your time and attention tonight. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out and be light. We will be having our online services only this weekend, so you can meet me right here at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday, and we'll be continuing our Rise series. All right. I want to thank you again for your time and attention. Take care, and God bless.